When I say that Coleridge intended to finish Christabel, I mean that he imagined that someday he would sit down and begin writing new parts to the poem, and that these would somehow conclude the story of Christabel and Geraldine and Sir Leoline. The obstacle to doing this, as he saw it, wasn't to do with coming up with a story about what would happen to these characters, but that he could see that the whole atmosphere of the poem might be made inconsistent by doing so. And he referred to witchery by daylight. And what he meant by this was that it's one thing to have shadowy suggestions of a supernatural being in the ambiguity of a nighttime setting, but it's another thing entirely to have it explicitly visible in the clarity of daytime. Another problem which I mentioned is that by the time he sat down to write part 2, Coleridge's perspective on the spirit world had changed, and that has a lot to do with what I'm going to say now about part 2. Although he began it a couple of years later, this second part of the poem picks up where part 1 left off. The atmosphere of death and the presence of ghosts is reiterated, although Geraldine is feeling pretty well as she wakes up in the morning. She has been rejuvenated, we are told, by the night's activities.
For she beliketh drunk and deep of all the blessedness of sleep, and while she spake her looks, her air, such gentle thankfulness declare, that so it seemed her girded vests grew tight beneath her heaving breasts.
Geraldine's first meeting with Sir Leoline follows. Immediately, she makes an emotional claim on Sir Leoline by declaring herself the daughter of Sir Roland de Vaux of Triarmain. Leoline is fired up by what Christabel referred to in part 1 as his stout chivalry. Now Leoline is full of ideas that he will have the knights who abducted Geraldine rounded up and challenged to fight for their lives at court. He'll restore Geraldine to her father, Sir Roland, and he'll atone for his bitter words to Roland, which caused them to cease being friends years ago. Leoline announces he'll dispatch Bard Bracy as his emissary to Roland, but not so fast, because Bracy has had a prophetic dream vision.
In my sleep I saw that dove, that gentle bird whom thou dost love, and calls by thy own daughter's name. Sir Leoline, I saw the same, fluttering and uttering fearful moan, among the green herbs in the forest alone, which, when I saw and when I heard, I wondered what might ail the bird, for nothing near it could I see, save the grass and green herbs underneath the old tree, and in my dream methought I went to search out what might there be found, and what the sweet bird's treble meant, that thus lay fluttering on the ground. I went and peered, and could descry no cause for her distressful cry, yet for her dear lady's sake I stooped, methought, the dove to take, when lo! I saw a bright green snake coil around its wings and neck.
I want you to notice two developments in how Geraldine is presented to us in part 2 as opposed to part 1. The first is that the presentation is much more explicit, and the second is that the imagery associated with Geraldine is so Christian or Judaic, and there's no hint of pagan thought at all in part 2. We are now dealing with a quite conventional and straightforward idea of the serpent as tempter, as someone who leads characters to evil, the corrupter. The imagery is repeated several times in part 2. Christabel sees Geraldine's eyes shrivel up momentarily to resemble serpent's eyes. And twice we are told of Christabel making a hissing sound. This is ominous. It's as though she has been infected by Geraldine and now is beginning to display symptoms herself. Christabel is powerless to act, and Leoline significantly, perhaps under enchantment, turns from his daughter who has collapsed to the floor and leads forth Geraldine arm in arm. My point is that for our study of character, we have a uniquely unstable character in Geraldine compared to other dark heroes we encounter on this course and other femme fatale on the reading list as well. We can confidently say she is a femme fatale, although we can't be much more precise than that. For most of part one, we infer or discern Geraldine's supernatural nature from incident. Compare the list I gave in part one of these associations with the list I just gave about part two and the explicit references to serpent imagery. It's all much more straightforward. It's all much more direct. How Coleridge would have resolved these tensions to finish the poem is unclear, and I think it just couldn't be done. But for early fans of the poem, particularly part one in recitation, part of the magic of Christabel lay in this uncertainty, the evocation of the mysterious creature Geraldine, and only being able to guess at her overall purpose.